Homer's Iliad is the most famous work of ancient Greek literature. It is, today, a staple of any classical and humanities-based education. So why should we continue to read Homer, even though his poem is over 2,500 years old? What does he have to say to us living today, us creatures with all the comforts of technology and wealth denied to Homer and his kinsmen? The Song of Homer is still moving because Homer's epic deals with the most fundamental questions that we, as humans, still consider in our lives living in the 21st century. The most famous, of course, is not war, death, although that runs replete throughout the Iliad. It is the question of what is our place in the cosmos and what will lead to our salvation. It is undoubtedly true that the stories of the Iliad and also the Odyssey are rooted in oral culture. Moreover, the now lost epic, the Cypria, implies a widespread familiarity with the Trojan War narrative and the consciousness surrounding it long after the supposed events transpired. Yet none of this entails, of course, the irrelevance of Homer, or that Homer is just a name attributed to a collective process. Homer may have served as a sort of final redactor to the Trojan War story, a view in scholarship held by many classicists, most famous of them being M.L. West. Even so, what Homer provided is what he undeniably wanted us to remember from this long and living oral tradition, spanning generations and centuries, and linking the present with the past. As such, we need to take Homer seriously instead of dismissing him. We need to take what Homer gave us instead of speculating on what is missing or what was added. The few remaining fragments of the Cypria show, at the very least, that the Greek intelligentsia, the poets, the singers, the bards, were familiar with the whole backstory of the Trojan War, up to the enslavement of Lycaon, and also the death of Achilles, the burning of Troy, the fleeing of Aeneas. Hesiod's Theogony, for instance, ends with a few short reflections on Achilles, Odysseus, and Aeneas, the heroes of the Trojan War, indicating familiarity with the aftermath of the Trojan War to the 8th century poets as well. So they knew how the rest of the story was supposed to go, even though Homer doesn't tell us the rest of that story. To understand Homer, we must begin with his rival Hesiod. The story goes that the two poets were bitter rivals, and that Hesiod won first place in a poetry contest against the blind poet of the two defining epics of Western literature. Hesiod's surviving works, Theogony and Works and Days, are much easier reads than Homer's two monumental epics. Perhaps the brevity of those works allows for people to give Hesiod sole credit, but the breadth and scope of Homer's work, ironically, must demand collective credit, even though other authors have individually produced monumental works as long or longer than Homer's two masterpieces, yet we don't exactly have the authorship controversies regarding those works. There remains a long-standing dispute over whether Hesiod's poems were written before Homer. In The New Science, Giambattista Vico, a 17th and 18th century Italian humanist, scholar, and philosopher, convincingly explained that the older tradition of poetry is that of sublime violence, even if Vico's reading of Homer is often wanting at best. Vico, for instance, famously said that Homer was primitive and couldn't possibly have written the Iliad and the Odyssey, thus bequeathing to the rest of 18th and 19th and early 20th century scholarship that idea that the poem was a collective process until the mid and later 20th century, which restored a final poet, whom we call Homer, as the final redactor of the poem, the Iliad, that we have. Nevertheless, with this axiomatic foundation in place by Vico, that poetry represents the origins of human intellectual thought in the form of sublime violence before its movement into rational philosophy, it is quite clear that Hesiod's content is older than Homer's, irrespective of who penned their classics first. Anyone who has read the Theogony knows that blood, lust, and violence run replete through its pages, at a degree even far greater than Homer, and especially since Hesiod's poem celebrates violence, while, as we shall see in this lecture, Homer's epic actually subtly rebukes it. Moreover, Hesiod's poem is about the gods, and Homer's poem is about mortal men, even if the gods feature prominently in it. The writings of Hesiod and Homer are cosmogonic poems. They are, therefore, works of poetic metaphysics, in the words of Vico. The Hesiodic cosmos is entirely about the gods. Human actors do not appear apart from the authorial voice asking the muses to sing praises to the violent gods of the cosmos, who castrated their fathers and participated in patricidal usurpation to reign supreme over the stars. When the poem ends with the mentioning of Achilles, Odysseus, and Aeneas, it is just offhand. None of the human characters are actors and movers of the Theogony. The prime movers of Hesiod's poem are the gods, and it is Zeus, in particular, who wins the adoration of Hesiod and the Muses. The Hesiodic cosmos is an erotic and violent, strife-filled universe. Hesiod's poem opens infamously with, "Muses of Helicon, let us begin our song with them, who hold the great and holy mountain of Helicon, and around its violet-like spring altar of exceedingly strong Kronos dance on dainty feet, and who, after bathing their soft skin in the Permeosis, or the spring of the horse, or holy Olmeos on the peak of Helicon, form their dances, beautiful dances that arouse desire, and they move erotically." The erotic overtures are evident enough, and the erotic overture also prefigures the violence to come. There are two genealogies of gods in the Theogony. The first line is pre-existent. The primordial deities are the first gods we are introduced to. Some are named and others not. The two most important are Gaia, Mother Earth, and Uranus, Father Sky. These gods, most importantly, are not the product of violence or sex, though they do happen to have sexual desires. The second line of gods, which includes the Titans and the Olympians, along with the other monsters of Greek mythological lore, is the product of violence and sex, and often violent sex, since the two are intimately interconnected in the Theogony. Hesiod details for us how Uranus came across the wide bosom of Gaia, and their marital union stemmed from Uranus's uncontrollable lust. Uranus preys upon Gaia and engages in predatory sex, which injures the mother goddess and results in the birth of the Titans. Worried that his children will hate him and usurp his authoritarian power, Uranus seals up the Titans deep in Gaia's fertile womb, which causes her much pain. As the Titans grow and move about, Gaia's tummy expands and causes her to moan and scream in pain, an obvious allusion to sex. The birth of reason in the Hesiodic cosmos is through hatred. Reason is the product of resentment and the desire to harm. Cunning Gaia, we are told, fashions a sickle out of the materials of the earth and implores one of her children to attack Uranus and bring forth their liberation, their deliverance. Kronos is the only Titan willing to take up this challenge. Kronos seizes the sickle not out of love for Gaia, but out of hatred for his father. He then ambushes the Sky Father god in an act of patricidal usurpation that gives birth to the rest of the world and the Olympian deities. As Hesiod writes, "Great Uranus came, bringing the night, and spread out around Gaia, desiring Philotes, and was extended. His son reached out from ambush with his left hand, and in his right he held the sickle, long and serrated, and the genitals of his father he quickly reaped and threw them behind his back to be carried away. But they did not flee from his hand fruitlessly. As many drops of blood spurted forth, all of them Gaia received. The blood that spurted forth from Uranus's castration, falling onto Gaia's fertile body, gave birth to the monsters and the Furies. More graphically, however, is how this act of sexual violence and patricidal usurpation birthed the Olympians and sets the stage for the war of the Titans and the overthrow of the Titans by the Olympian deities. Hesiod writes, in that most sublime moment of the poem, as soon as Kronos lopped off the genitals with the sickle, they fell from the mainland into the much surging sea, so that the sea carried them for a long time. Around them a white foam from the immortal skin began to arise. In it a maiden was nurtured. First she drew near holy Cythera, and from there she arrived at Cyprus, surrounded by water. From within, a majestic and beautiful goddess stepped, and all around grass grew beneath her slender feet. Aphrodite, foam-born goddess, gods and men call her beautiful because she was nurtured in foam. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Those gods, born of lust and violence, have the spirit of lust and violence coursing through their veins, the very fiber of their existence. Kronos is as equally vindictive as his father. Terrified by the prospects of losing his power, he eats his children to preserve his power. Just as Kronos, alone, rose to challenge his tyrannical father, so it is that Zeus is the only Olympian to rise and challenge his tyrannical father. Zeus rallies the Olympians and launches the great war of the gods. Thunder and lightning reign over the earth, and the drums of war and violence sound forth to break the trees, hills, and mountains. Again, let us quote from Hesiod, who reflects on this moment. The heavy pounding of their feet reached murky Tartaros, as did the shrill screams of the terrible pursuit and powerful missiles. Thus they hurled mournful darts at one another. The sound of both reached starry Uranus as they cried out. They clashed with a great war cry. After defeating the Titans, Zeus then slays the ferocious, snake-like monster, Typhoeus, to solidify his place as the supreme god of the Olympian pantheon, the pantheon of all the deities of Greece. Hesiod's cosmos, as we can see, is one governed by strife. The agon is fundamental to the Hesiodic cosmos. There is, as the poem concludes, no hope in the Hesiodic cosmos of strife, violence, sex, lust, and war. The muses sing of the gods who are strong enough and willing enough to overthrow their parents and seize power for themselves. It is an unadulterated celebration of lust, sex, and war. The weaker gods who sat back, terrified of the prospect of engaging in bloodshed, are the gods whom the muses brush aside and forget. No songs for them. Hesiod's Theogony is ultimately a praise poem to Zeus, but it is also, to a lesser extent, a praise poem to Kronos, the other god who warred with his father and set in motion the movement of the universe to Zeus's triumph over the cosmos. Hesiod's cosmos is one in which hatred, resentment, strife, struggle, and war ultimately triumph. Furthermore, the Theogony is a so-called heroic poem. It sings of the heroic deeds of Zeus. But what are the heroic deeds of Zeus, celebrated by the muses and the poet? The deeds worthy of praise in the Theogony are militant deeds of conquest, violence, and usurpation. Zeus, and Zeus alone, in the end, is worthy of praise for his courage in rebelling and defeating his father and slaying the vicious monsters of Greek mythological lore. In slaying gods and beasts, monsters, and divinities, Zeus sets the heroic archetype we are familiar with in the rest of Greek mythology, the hero killing monsters and vindictive supernatural entities. This bleak and conflictual worldview is not just contained in epic heroic poetry. The histories of Herodotus begin with the agonistic portrait of the world reminiscent of Hesiod. Herodotus quickly discusses the Persian account of the abduction of Io to Egypt, the Greek abduction and rape of Europa, then the story of Paris's abduction and rape of Helen, which sparked the Trojan War. Throughout the histories, we witness with Herodotus, cycles of violence leading to vengeance and retributive justice, and egoistic power and pride ending in destruction. We also see this in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. This cycle then renews itself individually and collectively over the course of the works of Greek history. How violence, cycles of violence, lead to vengeance, egoistic power and pride, and death and destruction. It's not simply the heroic poetry which operates in this framework. It is also the framework that the Greek historians use as well. While Herodotus rationalizes the mythological stories wherein human actors, rather than capricious gods, are ultimately responsible for these crimes, again, Herodotus's cosmos is still one of sublime violence, just as much as Hesiod's cosmos is. Befitting the rationalizing tendency of Herodotus and the later Greek philosophic and historical tradition, the answer to the problem of human violence is honoring of the law. Homer, however, offers us something far greater, moving, and more powerful than the historians and the philosophers, the poets who preceded him, and the poets who followed him. Those of us who know Homer well and who have read the Iliad know that his world, his cosmos, is also dominated by this cosmos of violence. But within that cosmos of violence, the violent cosmos given to us by Hesiod, we begin to see the birth of love and how love can bring peace and healing into a world of war. It is in this bleak cosmic reality that Homer enters the stage of world history. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son, Achilles. Homer's opening line is blasphemous and revolutionary. Hesiod's muses sing of the gods. Homer's muses sing of a man. This opening marks the great turning in human consciousness, the great turning that begins the Western tradition of humanism, and the desire to understand man in the midst of the vast, dark, and often violent cosmos, to return again to that opening question about why we should read Homer. Homer is truly asking us to understand ourselves, the cosmos we inhabit, and what it means to be a human living in the world. The gods are present and capricious in Homer's two epics, but the opening of the Iliad sets the tone that the grand song of Homer is about. It is dedicated to men rather than to the gods. The Homeric cosmos doesn't dispense, as we know, with the Hesiodic cosmos, though it does subvert it. Rage, as the opening indicates, is very much part of the world. Strife governs the Homeric cosmos as much as it does the Hesiodic cosmos. The gods are as cruel and mischievous as they were in the Theogony. But Homer opens the cosmos to something new, something that has defined the human thirst for meaning ever since. Redemption by love and the human agency to make it manifest, to make it real. The Iliad is not an epic of hypermasculinity and war, as it can easily and superficially appear to be at first glance. Rather, it is a grand love poem of cosmic scope and proportions. For the Iliad is not merely a love story, like a romance between two individuals, but a love story that brings forth healing in the cold and dark cosmos, governed by lustful strife, war, and rape. The word salvation in English comes from the Greek word salve, which means to heal. The love story at the center of the Iliad isn't about saving two individuals in the midst of a torrential maelstrom, but a story about how love heals the very fabric and the entirety of the cosmos we inhabit. The epic, as we know, is the song of the metamorphosis of Achilles, but it is also the song of a growing consciousness in the cosmos, moving away from the purely agonistic cosmos of the older cosmogonic tradition recounted by Hesiod. The metamorphosis and the redemption of Achilles is not just about Achilles. The metamorphosis and the redemption of Achilles, seen at the end of the poem, is also about us. All the characters of the Iliad find themselves in two competing galaxies that divide the cosmos. The first galaxy is one of strife. The men and women who occupy it, or formerly occupied it, exude the Hesiodic spirit of lust, violence, strife, and war. They are moved solely by the spirit of conflictual lust, the conflictual lust that defined the gods in Hesiod's Theogony. Diomedes, to my mind, is the quintessential hero who occupies this first galaxy. Diomedes is introduced as we would expect Achilles to have been introduced. The great Greek warrior is a madman who thrives in the chaos of struggle. As the war wages, itself the manifestation of the agon governing the cosmos, Diomedes kills men left and right and injures the gods when he spears Ares and slashes the skin of Aphrodite. As Diomedes slays countless Trojans, Homer brilliantly subverts the hypermasculinity of the Hesiodic fantasy of militant and masculine men. The men that Diomedes kills are men with names, men with families, men with faces. Homer's painstaking description of the death process is not a gory celebration of violence, but a subtle subversion of the Hesiodic ideal. In naming the men who die and giving us their lineage, we are reminded that these men who have their entrails spilled out over the sands and beaches of Troy are sons, husbands, and fathers. Alongside the description of death are human images of men reaching out to their beloved comrades in agony, and brief backstories of their birth and childhood, raised in serene green pastures by tender and loving parents. That image of peace and love, that is the great hope that Homer is aiming for. We also see the rage-filled Diomedes in his pure form during the funeral games held for Patroclus. The funeral games held for Patroclus revealed Diomedes as the man who thrives in conflict, chaos, and strife. It doesn't even have to be war in order for us to realize that Diomedes is completely governed by the Hesiodic spirit. Apollo intervenes in the chariot race, allowing certain others to overtake the strife-filled killer. Diomedes, seeing that he is no longer in first place, begins to cry in rage. What should have been a moment of honor for a hero turns into a chaotic and strife-filled event, with men and gods alike clawing at one another and conniving for the top prizes of honor in funeral games. What should have been the grand moment of unity, love, in honor of a fallen comrade, Patroclus, becomes a moment of division as the Greeks quarrel with one another on the racetracks and hurl insults at their comrades in arms. The other charioteers stumble and fall, cutting their flesh, causing blood to spill out on the sand. And Diomedes eventually takes back first place and triumphs. He wins. Rage is what leads to victory for those sad and sorry souls trapped in the galaxy of strife. Paris is a other notable character who occupies this galaxy of strife. Unlike Diomedes, who thrives on conflict, Paris thrives on lust, which is just another manifestation of strife, if we're going to be honest. He is even more primeval than Diomedes in this respect. At least Diomedes fights. He's a combatant in war. That's the chaos. That is the strife that he loves, that he is governed by. Paris cannot control his urge to dominate a beautiful woman, the quintessential object of his fantasy and desire. The sight of Helen causes him to move away and to abandon his duties to family and fatherland, especially during his duel with Menelaus. Whisked off by Aphrodite, the lustful shepherd prince of Troy has his eyes full of fear turn into a gaze, a fantastical sexual desire. When he sees Helen in front of him, he is now moved away from the war on the beach, and he finds himself in the peace and comfort of a bedchamber. He retires to that bedchamber to have sex with the very woman he abducted, which sparked the most famous war in Western mythological history. What we find in the character of Paris, just as we find in the character of Diomedes, is how civilization, duty and responsibilities cannot exist in this first governing galaxy of the cosmos. Only strife and lust reign supreme. Again, the funeral rites and the funeral games, funeral burial, the great rite of Greek civilization is destroyed in the funeral games by Diomedes. The Diomedes doesn't care about the death of Patroclus. He simply cares about winning the laurels and the honors of other men for winning a chariot race. He subverts civilization's honoring of the dead. And so too Paris. He abandons his duty to his family, to his brother, to his father, to his city, to his countrymen. He abandons all of it because he cannot control his own sexual desire for a mere woman. The second galaxy is represented by civilization and the love that accompanies it. Homer undeniably has prejudicial favoritism for this dim star in the cosmos. Troy is the physical embodiment of the world of order, an order premised on love, specifically devotedness. In contrast to the spirit of lust, violence, and strife, the second galaxy is governed by love, order, and devotion. The uncontrollable passions that spur the chaos of the Hesiodic cosmos are given an ordering to them that allow for the finer things in life to consummate and flourish. Hector is the quintessential hero who occupies this second galaxy. Hector is introduced as a family man, a man of faith and fatherland. When Hector's brother Helenus implores him to return to Troy, Helenus instructs him to give thanks to the gods upon his return and to perform his public duties for the city and its many citizens. Hector complies, and when he enters the city of Troy, his first words are to the wives and guards, "Pray to the gods." Hector's patriotic heart also races to help his Trojans, as Homer says, throughout the poem. Hector is a man moved by devotion to the gods, his father, his family, and his fatherland. The Romans eventually invented a word that we are all familiar with to describe such devotion, pietas, or piety, which is duty or dutifulness. The very name Hector in Greek also testifies to this ordered love that the Prince of Troy exudes. Hector means one who holds or one who possesses. The name is not insignificant. Hector is portrayed as the conduit, the very soul that holds the two worlds together. He takes his passion and orders them to the products of civilization, family, duty, and religion. Whereas Diomedes and Paris are just wholly and totally consumed by their passion and therefore cannot bring it into the order of civilization, Hector shows us how you can take the passion of the heart and utilize them, bring them together, and for it to be the glue that holds the world of passion and order together. Everything he does is out of love for his father, his family, and his fatherland. He always has them in mind. He holds the realms of the divine and the temporal together. Pray to the gods, again, the first words out of his mouth when he re-enters Troy. To whom? The wives and guards of Troy. Thus, his communication is an ordering of the world of the divinities and the world of men, as much as he holds back the Greeks from conquering Troy. He is the man who holds. The most touching moment of Hector's life is recounted when he disrobes himself before his infant son, Astyanax. Standing on the walls of Troy, surrounded by strife, chaos, and war, death and destruction, the impressive and hidden figure of Hector terrifies the young babe. Astyanax clings to his mother for comfort. Hector, however, provides a quasi-incarnational moment of revelatory face-to-face love. Seeing his son in distress, and understanding that it is because he is donning his battle armor, the great prince takes off his armor to reveal his face and tender body, and then cradles his son in his arms. The cries of Astyanax fade away as he falls asleep in the soft arms of his father, who offers up again a prayer to the gods for protection. This most moving scene of the great warrior prince is subversive, because Hector's greatest moment is an act of love rather than an act of war, and Achilles will eventually follow this pattern by the conclusion of the Iliad. Other characters fall into these two galaxies, but there are also individuals who oscillate between the two. Helen finds herself being pulled into the orbit of order and civilization, but not without regret and consequences for her prior life in the cosmos governed by lust. Agamemnon and Menelaus also occupy the cosmos of strife. Achilles, that other rage-filled killer, starts off in the first galaxy, but as mentioned, over the course of the song, of Homer's grand song of love, he comes to embrace the galaxy of ordered love. And this is what the poem is about. How love redeems and heals the world, brings forth our immortality, and allows human nature to flourish. Indeed, Homer goes as far as to suggest true virtue, true happiness, true peace is found in acts of love. And so we turn to the love that metamorphosizes Achilles. We all know that Achilles is the greatest warrior, the greatest killer in the Greek army, even if we've never read the Iliad and just know the songs and the laurels of Achilles that have been sung down through the millennia. But what starts the standoff between Agamemnon and Achilles? The rift that causes Achilles to sulk in his tent and refuse to engage in combat until the very end of the poem. That is Agamemnon's theft of Briseis, Achilles' bride-to-be. Briseis reveals this information when she weeps over the body of Patroclus, another character who exuded the power of the galaxy of calming and ordered love, when she says, "But you, Patroclus, you would not let me weep, not even when the swift Achilles cut my husband down, not even weep. No, again and again you vowed you'd make me, godlike Achilles' lawful wedded wife. You would sail me west in your warships, home to Phthia, and there with the Myrmidons hold my marriage feast. So now I mourn your death. I will never stop. You were always kind." This moment, this passage where Briseis weeps over the dead body of Patroclus, is very important for the reader to understand. One, it reveals to us the true reality of Achilles' relationship with Briseis, and why he really is pissed that Agamemnon stole her from him in order to calm the anger of the gods at the beginning of the poem. But it also reveals to us how kind of a man Patroclus is or was. For Briseis, Patroclus is not remembered here as a great warrior, even though he was. He was a greater man in his kindness and love, and that is what Briseis remembers of Patroclus. Patroclus is the ideal man, not Achilles, at least at this moment in the epic. And we even witness Patroclus tenderly heal wounded soldiers, his comrades, out of love for them, like when he heals Eurypylus, who returns wounded with an arrow in the thigh, in desperate need of the healing touch of Patroclus and the Myrmidons. The abduction of Briseis intentionally mirrors the abduction of Helen that sparked the war, and now sparks the war between Agamemnon and Achilles, which brings untold suffering to the Greeks, which is principally what the first part of the Iliad is about, until Achilles finally dons his armor and enters into battle. Achilles sulks in his tent like an infantile adolescent, upset that the lord and controller of men, Agamemnon, has stolen his bride-to-be. It is easy to be put off by Achilles when we are introduced to him because of his refusal to aid his comrades, his countrymen, his friends at arms. As we should. But the animosity we hold towards Achilles allows for his most powerful redemption at the poem's conclusion. The fury of Achilles is unleashed through a series of events, beginning with Hera's seduction of Zeus. Zeus has intervened, at least temporarily at this moment in the poem, on the side of Hector and the Trojans, who are pushing the Greeks to the brink of breaking. Achilles refuses to enter battle, but allows Patroclus and his Myrmidons to help the Greeks in this time of crisis. Patroclus near single-handedly turns the tide, even slaying the great warrior Sarpedon, until Patroclus himself is cut down by Hector. In the maelstrom of war and petty divine sexual fantasies and plotting and violence, the death of Patroclus unbalances the cosmos. The world burns and bathes in blood due to the skullduggery and the triumph, at this moment, of the Hesiodic cosmos. Love needs to restore the disorder wrought by strife's expansion over the world. Patroclus' death takes away the calming and ordering spirit he provided over Achilles during his prior sulking, over his comrades wounded in arms, over Briseis, who leaned on Patroclus to bring her kindness and love. Patroclus was a bringer of orderly love to Briseis when her city had been conquered, and he also served as the force of orderly love over Achilles during his refusal to fight after Agamemnon seized Briseis, and again over the wounded comrades returning back to the beach, having been battered and beaten by the Trojan warriors. The rageful Achilles, in his tent beside the calm of Patroclus, was outwardly at peace, though he remained inwardly at war with himself. It is as if Patroclus served as the orderly body constraining the rageful spirit of Achilles, crashing and turning about inside of him. With that body gone, and the spirit of rage unleashed, Achilles ventures forth into battle and turns the tide of war, but the world suffers and bleeds as a result. Patroclus, as the incarnate manifestation of love, kept the peace. With that love removed, rage and hate finally and totally consumes Achilles. As Achilles slaughters Trojans left and right, to which Homer again subtly subverts this hypermasculine war ideal by reminding us of the lineage of the fallen, one of the sons of Priam throws himself at the feet of Achilles. Lycoon defenselessly weeps for mercy. Achilles, in this domineering position, raises his sword and cuts open the young prince, whom he had previously captured, tending Priam's orchard, and sold off into slavery in the other earlier predecessor stories and songs of the Trojan War. This would have been known to Homer's audience, and thus again a massive shock that a young prince whom Achilles initially took pity on because of Patroclus, now that Patroclus is gone and Achilles is in a fit of rage, even though Lycoon throws himself defenselessly at the feet of Achilles, he slaughters him. After slaughtering Lycoon, Achilles vows to wipe out the seed of Priam from the face of the earth. Then, as we know, he famously duels and kills Hector and begins to defile Hector's body. This terrible rage of Achilles has been unleashed and fully manifested for all to see. The goddess of rage has seemingly triumphed. Achilles subsequently helps to arrange funeral games for Patroclus and holds Hector's body as if a trophy carcass, the great game killed by the great hunter. In his slaughtering of Hector, Achilles quickly devolves into a barbarous and ravenous dog. He is no longer the handsome Argive prince and Myrmidon leader that he once was. The animalization that is brought on by war consumes Achilles in full. This animalization has also consumed the whole world, as we witnessed in fire and bloodshed, consuming and drenching all the land. Here the great triumph of Homer actually begins. We have witnessed the full-throated and bloody return of the Hesiodic cosmos in terrible vengeance, with a sword of rage spilling blood over the earth. The galaxy of orderly love, of civilization and filial piety has been burned over by strife. Moreover, with Hector's death, there is no holder of the two worlds together. And it is quite interesting that the animalization of the cosmos, the complete death, carnage, and destruction unleashed over the world is only after the two great heroes of love, Hector and Patroclus, are removed from the poem. The torch of love, that unitive force which binds the cosmic galaxies together, lies extinguished on the ground. The world burns, as mentioned, as a result, and chaos reigns supreme. Priam is the other great character who embodies the values of the galaxy of love, which Homer is constructing for us. He is a good king, a gentle and loving father, and a man devoted to his son. Priam's love for Hector compels him to enter the tent of Achilles against his better senses. In fact, Hector had thought that Achilles could be reasoned with before losing his nerve, only to accept his fate by turning back to die at the killer's hand. Furthermore, we know that Achilles has vowed to wipe the seed of Priam off the face of the earth. With a defenseless Priam now in his tent, Achilles quite literally has the opportunity to consummate his vow of rage. Strife, rage, and hate have every opportunity to triumph with Priam in the tent of Achilles. When Priam throws himself at the feet of Achilles and begs for the return of Hector's body, we witness the recapitulation, the repeat of the same image of Lycaon throwing himself at the feet of Achilles and begging for mercy. In this domineering image and position, we fully expect that Achilles will slay Priam. After all, we have seen this image before and know what Achilles had done. This is compounded by the fact that Achilles has sworn to kill Priam and all his sons and daughters. He has just vowed that in the poem's epic climax, or at least the climax that we think is the climax, instead of seeing this moment as the true climax of what Homer is working toward. But that most famous and fitting conclusion to an unfinished work manifests itself in this moment. Achilles emphasizes with the grieving father. Memories of Peleus' love for Achilles are sparked deep within the ravenous and rage-filled killer as he witnesses the tears and love of Priam for Hector. Instead of lifting the sword to slay his arch-nemesis, Achilles lifts Priam up in dignity, and the two men weep together in a tender and loving embrace that doesn't lead to violence, as the foe embraces of Paris and Helen, and Hera and Zeus previously did. In this moment, we see Achilles inherit the torch once held by Hector as the man who holds the two worlds together. It is also in this moment that Achilles also honors his friend, Patroclus, most of all by becoming a man like him, a gentle and kind, healing lover. The metamorphosis of Achilles is complete. He has learned love and is truly healed, saved by that power of love. Love for Homer is a uniquely human experience and reality. The gods do not love. The gods are only filled with condemnable lust to satiate their ego. Humans, however, have this most precious gift. The Iliad, then, is a long and arduous movement to the manifestation of love in the world. Love entails relationships. Love entails empathy. Love leads to the forgiveness, and forgiveness gives way to that healing, that saving healing which brings restoration and peace into the world. Love is the reality that humans seek in order to have a meaningful and purposeful life. This is where Homer is most ingenious and radical. In the contrast between Hector and Achilles, Homer has actually shown us the limits of filial love, piety, and devotion. All of that Hector embodied and represented, yet he died. That filial love, piety, and devotion, the love to his family, piety and devotion to the gods and to his city, could not bring healing peace into the world. For all the virtues Hector exuded, he died. And with the death of Hector, the cosmos is torn apart by lust, strife, war, death, and destruction. No amount of filial love, piety, or devotion can restore this wounded cosmos. Instead, Homer offers an even more radical solution: forgiveness, specifically forgiveness to one's enemies. The highest reality of love isn't devotion, but forgiveness. Forgiveness as the highest reality of love is what Achilles learns, and what we all learn through the metamorphosis of Achilles by the Iliad's conclusion. In this way, Achilles is, as Homer says, greater than Hector. With Achilles, we witness the true birth of the galaxy of love in all its splendor and all its heroism. It is also important to note that it is the memory of a father's love for his son that becomes the triumphant spirit at the conclusion of the work, permitting forgiveness. So even though filial love does not bring healing restoration into the world, it remains quite important in the movement to how we can forgive our enemies. The memory of love helps to rekindle the heart of love that had been hardened over the years inside of Achilles. It is the memory of love which rekindles that lost spark of divinity residing deep inside humans. Without the memory of love, which Priam's action sparked, Achilles would have likely killed his Trojan adversary in the final act of the triumph of the Hesiodic cosmos of rage, resentment, and strife. Instead, we witness the subversion of the Hesiodic cosmos through loving forgiveness, which was brought forth by the memory of a father's love for a son. And thus, Homer leaves the possibility of how, even though filial love did not bring about the salvation of the Trojan world, at least as related to Hector, it does permit enemies to embrace each other as friends. The conclusion of the Iliad is so perfect and moving, even though we know Achilles is going to die and Troy is still to be burned. Despite this, we do not feel cheated. Love has conquered hate and triumphed over the cosmos of strife. Love, particularly in the form of forgiveness, heals the fractured and burning world. A peace, albeit temporary, is the outcome of the love shared between Achilles and Priam. That peace is a foretaste of the serenity of the cosmos of love Homer is painfully advocating over the course of the epic. That peace is a roadmap for rebuilding a world in ruins, a world ruined by war. For a cosmos of love would be a cosmos of peace, as we see at the conclusion of the Iliad. The greatest deeds of the greatest heroes of the Iliad are actually deeds of love. Hector's love to his son, Andromache's love for her husband, Hecuba's tearful lament for Hector to stay inside the walls of Troy, Priam's love for his own son, Hector, Achilles' forgiving love to Priam. These are the greatest deeds of the greatest heroes who populate the epic. The heroes who live eternally etched in our memories despite the fires of sublime violence are Hector, Priam, Patroclus, Achilles, among others, who manifest moments of loving intimacy bound up with the consciousness of tragedy and mortality. The most moving moments of the Iliad are often these brief, intimate, and personal manifestations of love in the midst of war. Thus we see our heroes as mortal humans just like us, lovers, husbands, fathers, sons, friends. The truly heroic deeds celebrated by Homer are not deeds of the sword and spear, but deeds of intimacy, compassion, and comforting love. Again, think back of those great moving moments in the Iliad, when Hector reveals himself to his son and cradles him in his arms. That is a moment of comforting love. When Patroclus heals the wounded Eurypylus, that is a moment of comforting love. When Briseis weeps over the dead body of Patroclus, remembering his kindness, that is a moment of comforting love. And then, of course, the great triumph of the Iliad at the very end of the epic, when Achilles embraces Priam, lifts him up, and returns the body of Hector, bestowing a peace to the Trojans to allow them to bury Hector's body. That is a moment of comforting love. Love is what makes a man heroic, not how many men or monsters he has killed. Homer's revolution is, therefore, a humanistic revolution, one that Giambattista Vico should have noticed. Homer is the first humanist in the Western tradition. Rather than locate the nexus of moral healing with the capricious gods of Olympus, he finds it within the human agency for empathy and forgiveness. Love binds together what we previously thought impossible. Homer also begins the dialectical refinement of the pathological cosmos that the Greeks inhabited. Hesiod's cosmos of strife, moved by hate, ends in patricide, war, and divine rape. Hesiod's cosmos is sublimely violent. It is a sublimely violent world. Homer turns the Hesiodic cosmos on its head by going beyond the strife and hate-filled cosmos that Hesiod's muses sing praise about. Yet Homer doesn't discard the Hesiodic cosmos as much as he refines it. He takes the rage that governs the Hesiodic cosmos and opens the door to the possibility of love, a possibility of love not seen in the Theogony. In doing so, Homer carves out the redemptive and powerful quality of human agency in his work. Yes, the will of Zeus is still satisfied in the end, but how the will of Zeus is satisfied is left to human choice. Achilles could have returned the body of Hector to Priam any way he wanted. That is all the will of Zeus stipulated. There was no demand for peace. There was no demand that the body be returned in a good condition because it was protected by the gods in order for an honorable burial. The manner in which Achilles fulfilled the will of Zeus is, then, given the greatest expression of human magnanimity. It was the highest manifestation of love, which Homer sings will heal the world. This love, manifested by Achilles, surpasses the petty nobility of the capricious and unpredictable gods of the poem. The true heroism sung of in the poem is found in the human act of forgiveness, an act freely undertaken by Achilles at the close of the epic. There is no indication that Homer didn't believe in the Greek gods, but he certainly didn't think the gods existed for our salvation, for our healing. If the richly developed mythology of Pseudo-Apollodorus also existed in Homer's day, then the destruction of Troy and the death of Achilles were inevitable. Yet we do not need to be the puppets of the gods. Achilles finds it in his heart to weep with Priam and forgive him. There is nothing in the Bibliotheca of Pseudo-Apollodorus that indicates Achilles' metamorphosis from killer to lover was what the gods intended. Instead, Achilles achieves this for himself, sparked by a concrete encounter with a father's love for his son that breaks his own heart of iron. Homer, therefore, argues that the true nobility of the cosmos is the agency of moral and loving human beings. In the love expressed by the Homeric heroes, especially the loving forgiveness expressed by Achilles, the voice of Homer finally appears and sounds triumphantly. Homer is eternal because he begins the pilgrimage of Western literary reality as a journey through the battlefield of love and meaning. Homer inaugurates a near 3 millennia project that sees the human will and heart expressing itself in songs, poems that strike at the very essence of what it means to be human. Rather than take up the sword to find meaning, Homer exposes the futility of meaning in an agonistic, conflictual cosmos, and instead offers us meaning through the raw power of human sentimentality, through the serenity of the lyre, or, for those of us today, the enchantment of reading. Yet Homer also reveals to us the reality of love. Love is the product of strife, struggle, and hardship. Love is not a hunky-dory reality. Love is not a printable slogan to tape onto a car or stake into your yard. It is a struggle. It is a real struggle through strife, hardship, war, torment, even death and destruction. Will love save the world? Homer at least hopes so, and he wrote the grandest epic, showing how love can heal a wounded world and bring about the healing metamorphosis to even the worst of killers. Reading Homer gives us a glimpse of eternity, that eternal image of love, and how it brings serenity to the cosmos and the human soul. All the great songs of the Western artistic tradition sing of this image. Homer's final image in the Iliad is a city finally at peace, a peace brought forth by an act of forgiveness. Forgiveness brings peace. Peace to Achilles as an individual, and to all the Greeks and Trojans as a collective whole. Loving forgiveness touches more than just the self. It touches the entire world. It touches civilization. In many ways, we have journeyed through hell and ended at the city dreamt of by 3 millennia of seceding theologians, philosophers, poets, novelists, writers, musicians. Considering that Homer leaves us with the image of a cosmos at peace, the song and meaning of Homer becomes clear to us at the end of this long and arduous journey. The Iliad ends with the star of the galaxy of love at the center of the dark cosmos, brightly shining in the midst of the darkness which surrounds it. And shine ever so brightly it does, for it reveals what true heroism is all about.